Took away the beginning of my talk, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm going to repeat what she said about me. I'm going to... first, I want to thank you for inviting me and for having me speak here. As Marina said, my daily work at Font Foundry Waltermark revolves around font production and font technology. But for once, I'm not going to talk about the development of fonts or how to build tools that assist designers in developing fonts. This is going to be a very personal talk instead, where I take a step back and ask myself, what the heck am I doing and why? And I think it will help you to understand where I come from professionally for this talk. Apart from a very idealistic and somewhat naive professional freak phase, where I intended to be a hydrologist to save my beloved home region Ostfriesland from drowning to rising sea levels, my whole professional life gravitated around the idea of assisting people in communicating their thoughts. And I have degrees, as Marina said, in communication design and typeface design, and now I'm working as a font engineer at Waltermark. I bet many of you can relate. The longer you work in a particular field, the easier it is to lose sight of the bigger picture. And sometimes you just need to take a step back and reflect for a little bit. And that's where I am now, and I invite you to join me there in my head for the next 20 minutes or so. This presentation has a very snappy, a very snappy name. But what we are going to do is going to talk about written communication, and I'm going to start by having a look at it on a very abstract level. So on the one side, you have authors who have a very rich picture in their heads about what they want to talk about, and they try to transmit these thoughts through texts. And on the other side, there will be the reader that tries to reconstruct that picture in their heads as precisely as possible. George Orwell described the process of writing brilliantly. He said, when you think of a concrete object, you think wordlessly, and then, if you want to describe the thing you have been visualizing, you probably hunt about until you find the exact words that seem to fit it. In short, writers translate their ideas into symbols and logic, and readers try to translate back. Admittedly, part of the fun of reading especially fiction is that some things are left to your own imagination. When the author prefers to transmit their ideas as accurately as possible, we can add things like images or videos, graphics or illustrations, and a less obvious, but in my biased opinion, equally powerful tool to communicate a particular image is typography. In his essay, You Need an Opinion on Top of an Impulse, in the book Whatever Next Discourse on Typography, Jerry Leonidas, who's sitting right there, defines typography as the determination of structure and specification of appearance at the document level. But how can we communicate through typography? Cyrus Highsmith put it this way. He says, typography is the detail and the presentation of a story. It represents the voice of an atmosphere or historical setting of some kind. So you could say that typography, just like colors, contributes on how the reader perceives the content. That happens on a less obvious level. Smart people like Dr. Alessia Nicotra, Kevin Larson, or Bruno Mark are devoting a lot of their time investigating the relationship between type and emotions, and typography and emotions. And I will leave it to them to explain just how important the visual appearance of text is. But I'd like to use this opportunity for a little detour. I asked myself, what are the kind of considerations that determine typographic choices? And I came up with 3 broad categories: content, context, and functionality. And I give you some examples of these categories by looking at book typography, because I like books. If you design a book, you want to ask yourself, what is the genre? Are we, for example, designing typography for nature guides? It could look like this. Or is it a guide on how to produce printing paper? It might look like that. Is it a travel guide? Or a book of plays? Or is it a collection of songs? What's the style of the language? Is it a book full of journal entries like you would find in Dracula? Or is it a playful compilation of different styles of languages, like in this book? Or is it a highly factual book like this one about German surface vessels of the Second World War? Or maybe, since we are in a church, is it a prayer or a songbook? Again, poetry or plays are a style of language that needs special treatment. Or is it instruction manual that requires some tables in there so you can find your way around? Does the length of the text matter? Is it a reference book that you want to keep by your side all the time? Or is it this tiny little book about Berlin? Do you consider the time and the place? We all have different cultural backgrounds and experiences that affect our perception of type one way or another. So do you consider the time and where it will be distributed? And the people that read the books you design, do they buy paperbacks? Or can they afford bigger glossy versions of the same text? Is it a catalog? Who will be buying it? Are you designing for students? Is there a culture for literature of that kind in the country the book will be distributed in? What are the readers used to? What do they expect? Are there editorial conventions? This is the same book. On the left-hand side is the English version of Franz Kafka's The Trial, and on the left one is the German one. This is the inside of the German one, and this is the inside of the English book. And if you put them side by side, you will see that the type in the German book is set much denser. I can only speak for myself, but after a decade of almost exclusively reading English texts, I still find myself drawn to books with more ink on paper. And someone should really research this. It might be just my upbringing with mostly cheap paperbacks, but maybe it's something a lot of Germans have in common. Are you designing for dictionaries? Are they easy enough to use? In my opinion, this one isn't. Do your readers have special requirements? Are they kids? If so, did you make typographic choices that reflect that? Can they process this kind of typography easily? Do they expect something like that? Or rather like this one that was designed by Jan Tschichold, but is it appropriate? I don't know. Is this one more appropriate? This isn't by all means an exhaustive list of considerations that should define typographic choices. I hope they give you an idea of the care that has historically been put into making books, though. But how does this translate into the future? In the foreword to the book, The Work of Jan van Krimpen, Stanley Morrison wrote that he doesn't think that typography will continue in the future to be reproductions of the forms they have assumed in the past. He goes on to say that the nature of the instruments of production, of the materials required, of the processes involved, and of the audience to be communicated with will in varying degree change the letter forms and arrangements in typography. And I agree that the basic principle will always remain to be communication independent on technological advancement. But talking of which, where are we today? How do people read? How do we read? There's no definite answer to that. It depends on a lot of factors, like access to digital media and personal preference, but it can be said that more reading happens on screen now than it did 7 or 8 years ago, for sure. As digital text and technologies become more accessible, we gain new ways of reading. But is the reading experience comparable? The vast majority of studies conducted before the early 90s concluded that people read slower, less accurately, and less comprehensively on screen than they do on paper. As tablets and e-reading technology improve, reading digital books becomes more common, and attitudes are changing. Most people still prefer reading on paper, especially when reading intensively. Many, that includes me, miss the tactile experience and lack of an intuitive and satisfying way to navigate long text on digital devices. What do such navigational difficulties mean for reading comprehension, though? Compared with paper, screens may also drain more of our mental resources while we are reading and make it a little bit harder to remember what we just read. One line of research focuses on people's attitudes towards different kind of media. Whether they realize it or not, many people approach computers and tablets with a state of mind less conducive to learning than the one they bring to paper. I never not want to hear from my friend Sahar, but from personal experience, I'd like to add that getting away from multi-purpose screens improves concentration. I'm less distracted by notifications and pop-ups, or the temptation to check social media channels when I'm reading a printed book. To date, many engineers, designers, and user interface experts have worked hard to make reading on an e-reader or a tablet as close to reading as on paper as possible. But are we right in using a completely different ancient medium like the book as an example for what reading on screen should look like? Why not evolve screen-based reading into something else entirely? Screens offer readers experiences that paper cannot. Scrolling might not be the ideal way to navigate a long text, but some newspapers and magazines created articles that could not appear in print in the same way. This is the iPad version of the National Geographic magazine, and you can see I use this as an example for the main selling points for on-screen reading. For example, you can link to further information or take the reader to relevant sections in a click. Like here, you can tap to access various statistics related to being a female. Or here, you can click through history. You wouldn't be able to do that in a book. Text can also be supplemented with interactive activities or multimedia components. So you have videos or photo collections. And digital texts are instantly shareable and searchable. You don't have to flip through pages to find a sentence that you had previously read. You can just search for it. When it comes to intensively reading long pieces of plain text, paper and ink may still have an advantage, though. I wonder, while some of the subtle typographic considerations I mentioned earlier might only apply to print, do we neglect others, and do we fail to look for new typographic opportunities when it comes to reading on screen? In the past, we got away blaming technology, but I think that won't quite do it anymore. We have capable browsers at hand, high-resolution screens are on the rise, and especially readers of Latin-based languages can't complain about text rendering. So what's stopping us? Some of us might simply not know how to create valuable web typography. Some very smart people put really good resources and manuals out there. Two recent examples are Richard Rudder, who is sitting right there and taking a picture of the screen. Richard Rudder's Web Typography Handbook and Bramstein's Web Font Handbook. It's really not rocket science, and there's good up-to-date literature out there to help us through it. A lack of resources isn't a good excuse. So is it maybe convenience? Why would I worry about font loading strategies if I can use online publishing platforms like Medium? Well, about Medium, while I completely admire the effort the designers and typographers at Medium put into making the experience of reading a post on their website a pleasant one, at the end of the day, it's a cookie-cutter approach, and your article won't stand out, and worse, you won't be able to control certain typographic parameters that might be important to bring your message across. The apparent lack of typographic advancement when it comes to reading on screen is probably mostly down to performance considerations. Yes, most of us in this room are spoiled with fast-loading websites. We are used to decent Wi-Fi or network, and our devices are powerful. But there's a whole world outside our bubble, and while we might barely notice the weight of an additional font style or bigger language coverage, some person on a weaker network with an older smartphone will notice, and they won't wait until your website is loaded. They'll leave before they could read our content. And we don't want that. So we are trying to be careful, and we come up with new ways of keeping file size down without compromising typographic finesse. One opportunity as font makers, we could help our clients and their readers by using variable fonts, as we all know. I won't talk you through the obvious file savings between multiple static font files and a variable font that can access infinite instances within its design space. While I do wonder when we will see more variable fonts that add real typographic value, I'm super excited to see more and more people experiment with the technology, especially in new environments like AR. Andrew Johnson is definitely onto something at the moment. He allowed me to share a few of his experiments here, like this one that uses a static font of James Edmondson's Wolf monotypeface. And really interesting to me are these optical size variable font experiments in AR. This one uses CJ Dunn's unreleased typeface Louvette. CJ has been using the typeface for performance artist Caroline Pennypacker-Riggs's promotional material. The words you see are generated by starting with the 2 source words, which morph from one to the next by changing one letter at a time. The word morphing is inspired by concrete poetry, which uses similar techniques. Can you see how the contrast of the typeface changes depending on the distance between reader and type? This is also possible for reading on screen. I'm going to show you a crude demo that shows the potential of variable fonts for reading on screen. Looking at the distance of the reader to the screen, we can find the most suitable font variation. Oops. Right. Okay, so the closer I move to the screen, it affects on... Oh, you can't see it? Well, I see it. That's the wrong window. Now you can all see the next slides. There we go. Okay. Oh my God. Okay. Does it still work? I can't see it. Okay, let me try the other one. This one takes ambient light into consideration. So the ambient light sensor is right next to the camera of my laptop. So if I make it darker, it changes the background color and the weight and width of the font. If I close it completely, it should go. Well, there we go. All right. Let's go back to the presentation. The experience I just showed aren't new at all. While they certainly do respect the reader in the time and place, I do wonder, can web typography be more diverse than that? Responsive, dynamic, interactive, reactive, variable text is already achievable in one form or another. But is its responsiveness limited to the context, and is it constrained by the functionality? At the end of the day, does it support the author in bringing their message across, or do we treat all text more or less the same, no matter the website they are on? As type designers, we can often only speculate on the texts our typefaces will transmit, but what can we do to enhance web typography from our side? How can we make the best use of the technologies we have at hand, and how can we give typographers the tools they need to elevate reading experiences on screen? I don't have answers, not yet anyway, but by preparing this presentation for you, I took the opportunity to take the step back and review what role in the future of typography I want to play. And I concluded for myself that I want to keep working towards typographic sophistication on the web. And as an essential tool for communication, typography just shouldn't be compromised, in my opinion. I hope this oddly personal reflection on my professional career will also leave you with some food for thought. Thank you for your time. Oh, yeah. Anyone have questions? No?
Thank you for the lovely overview. And then it's great that we have talks that are not only